Hello there, and thank you for watching Misguided Musings. I'm your host, that man over there. Well, with the upcoming battle for Azeroth on the horizon, unless you're watching this in the future and are just coming back to wonder what I'm musing about, I decided that I wanted to go and talk about the armies that the humans had available to them for the actual war for Azeroth. And I'm not talking about as they existed now. I'm talking about as they existed before, during the whole original version of the game, because why not go back and look at how they originally were before revisionists came back and changed their own history. So, I'm going to now look over the most logical army structure I could think of for the Kingdom of Azeroth. To begin with, let's look at the basic unit of an Azerothian army, the Footmen. These are soldiers who seem to be armed with a sword and heater shield, with extra protection coming in the form of plate mail, though not full body as that picture indicates. For actually fighting, I assume from the way they are depicted in the game that they focus mainly on slashing at your enemies, with stabs being a more rare occurrence. Though, then again, that may be up to the actual training they would be given in real life, since I would personally go a little bit more on the stabby than the slashy side of things, but then again, they might just enjoy slashing, or that might just be the way they are taught how to fight. Regardless of that, I would go with something of a variation of the Legionnaire and Maniple system. So essentially, you have teams of 4 soldiers who would only be used for stuff like digging latrines or going on guard duty, who are always paired with another team to make them squads of 8. These would be arrayed one behind the other and could act in a rotating manner when fighting. These would be paired at either 10 to 15, though for this example I am going to use the lower numbers. So you would have a maniple of 10 squads of 8 men, so 80 men total. You would then take this maniple and pair it with another one in order to form a company of soldiers. Either 160 if you have 2 maniples of 80 men, or 240 if you go with the maniples of 15 squads, but again, I am going to go with the lower numbers for the rest of this example. If you are wondering why I would have the maniples paired into companies like this, I will explain it a little bit later, but for now, just know that it is important that there are 2 maniples to every company. Beyond this, we have the cohort, which is formed of 6 companies, which at the minimum numbers I am describing, would be 960 men. A fair amount, and this would be the basic unit you move around the battlefield to fight, since 160 men isn't really going to make that much of a difference in a battle, but 960 men would. To top this off, 5 cohorts would make up an entire legion, which would be 4,800 footmen total. A decent enough unit for regimental purposes, essentially. You could bring several legions together, pair them off with others, or, since they are modular in nature, take maniples or companies, or even whole cohorts that have been damaged, and swap them out for fresher ones or more relaxed ones. On that note, something I would do, and this is a bit of a tangent, but something I would do that's based off the legionary system is have the less experienced footmen at the front of any given unit, with the idea being, hey, if they survive their combat, great, that means we have another good soldier. If they don't, well, at least we only put the time necessary to buy the equipment and train him in, not needed to equip him and train him, and then however many years worth of campaigning he has under his belt. Moving on, the next unit in the Azerothian army are the crossbowmen. I'm sorry, I meant to say archers, because apparently crossbowmen took up too much space when they were creating this, but that is neither here nor there. Now essentially, these guys are very, very lightly armored, but they do have crossbows. Specifically, they have crossbows with what looks like an iron bow at the end of it, which means they have a lot of firepower behind them. I don't see a way of them spanning it naturally through the use of tools and such, so the only thing I can assume is that their archers or crossbowmen or whatever they are naturally strong enough to be able to pull back the steel on it and load in a bolt manually. So that either means these guys are impressively powerful, more powerful than most other humans are, and are capable of keeping up a sustained rate of fire while doing this, or the crossbow is very low poundage. I'm going to assume something between the two, with them having a sort of goat's hook device or another spanning device like that we just don't see, and move on to their organization. At the basic level, the archers are similar to the footmen in that they would be organized into teams of 4 that are never actually used for anything outside of patrols, and squads of 8, which are essentially rotating combat units, though the difference here is instead of one squad being stacked in front of the other, they would be stacked side to side, since they are crossbowmen, and you would want as much frontage as possible from them, but not necessarily too much. This would be then organized into the mana pool of 80 of them, and here's where the tricky thing comes in. I don't honestly think they would need the company level next, since you're not really going to have them rotating the same way you would with the footmen. So instead you would just move on straight to the cohort of 480 of them, again as close into a line as possible to allow maximum frontage, but still giving them some depth, so that way they are able to go with more of a rotating fire than just straight up everyone shooting a long line that's 10 kilometers long and doesn't actually get anything done. As with before, the cohort would be the basic unit you move around the battlefield, since 480 crossbowmen, or archers as they're called, would be fairly capable of laying down a reliable rate of fire that would take out most enemies they would encounter. Most enemies, which is why they would then be further organized into legions of 5 of these cohorts, so that way you could move them along on campaign. I would actually suggest to have 1 legion of crossbowmen or archers paired with every 1 legion of footmen, since, unlike with the Romans, the footmen don't really have anything akin to javelins or other long-range abilities built into them, so they're going to need all the extra support they can get, and a cohort here and there of archers just attached to the unit willy-nilly isn't going to help, so an entire legion permanently attached to each legion of footmen would honestly be one of the best ways to go about the whole getting rid of all the people you don't want on the battlefield, namely, not your side. The knights are the workhorse of the human army, pun fully intended, and seem to be wearing more plate mail, a larger shield, and go around on horses using their lances and sword to kill enemy. Well, I would say lances and swords, but it would appear in the picture here that they have some sort of flail, which is also further contradicted if you take the time to look over that page, because once again, it claims they have maces. Which, alright, fine, they're horsemen who go around using flails. This isn't a strategy I'm familiar with among actual horsemen, but for all I know, it could actually be very effective. It's just no one else has ever thought of putting down their lances and swords and javelins and longbows and short bows and whatever other weapons they would normally use on horseback to really give it a try. Then again, if a man on a horse is coming at me with a flail like that, I am still going to try to get as far out of his range as possible, since I don't want to find out, personally, if it is lethal or not. So beyond that, it comes the question of how exactly would you deploy these horsemen, since, well, clearly you should just ram them straight into the enemy lines. I will get to that, but keep that in mind when you are thinking about the way I am structuring their units. As you can tell by just looking at their base formation, things are a little different here. For starters, a squad and a team would essentially be the same thing, since it is nothing more than 4 knights or 4 horsemen, since 4 of them is enough to form a small apocalypse, and a mana pool of 10 units of 4 horsemen is 10 apocalypses coming down on you all at the same time. They would be arranged in more of a lance formation than the others, since you would want to go and try to pierce into your enemy. This is why the companies would still exist for them, since having 2 mana pools of them means you can either have them focus down on 2 different units, or 2 different weak points, or if there is one weak point you are very keen on exploiting, have the 2 mana pools just charge down and try to force their way through the same one. The cohorts would of course be made to accommodate this, with 6 companies of 80 horsemen, so 480 horsemen, going around acting somewhat more independent than most of the other units would, since they're supposed to go and exploit breaches in the enemy lines, or could charge in directly. But again, I'll get to that later when I get to it in further detail. Just know that a single cohort could theoretically charge through a single point in the line if they really needed to. After that, you have the Legion, which is 5 cohorts, so again, 2,400 knights on horseback, coming around, riding the battlefield, and attempting to destroy the enemies. Again, I would pair 1 legion of knights with 1 legion of footmen and 1 legion of crossbowmen, though again, those ratios could change depending on both the needs and availability of the given units. And so it would appear that we have before us a full army now. 4,800 footmen with swords forming up the core, with 2,400 crossbowmen or archers or whatever you want to call them to provide range support, and 2,400 knights whose main goal in life is to pierce through the enemy and cause as much problems or as many problems as possible, hopefully including an up to death. Although we would actually be missing some key parts of a complete army. Some key, often unglorious parts of a full army. If you thought the footmen had it bad, then welcome to the peasants. These are the actual workhorse of any of the armies. They are the ones who build the roads, who build the granaries, who build the barracks, who build the defenses, who build everything that the other people need and keep them in working order, and have absolutely no ability to defend themselves in battle. Still, given that footmen and archers and knights don't seem very keen on doing any of the actual hard work themselves, you are going to need an astronomical number of peasants compared to everyone else. Essentially, you would need 1 peasant for every team of footmen, so think of it like their pet. 1 peasant for every team of crossbowmen, both to help keep the machines running and help out with field fortifications and such, and 2 for every team or squad of knights, because not only are they helping take care of the knights and repair their equipment, they're also helping to take care of and feed their horses, and frankly, they're going to need all the help they can get. So that means that a full army would have thousands of peasants incapable of defending themselves and needing to stay with the baggage trains. Well, incapable might not actually be the right words. This beauty you see before you now is what is known as a catapult. More specifically, it would seem to be a mangonel. In order for a catapult to function, you would need a crew to keep it safe, as well as repair it, and make sure that it actually fires whatever you're trying to fire. This is where the peasants would be most useful. A team of 4 peasants could potentially move around one of these mangonels, load it up, keep it repaired, or even make new ones if the need really arose for them to have to do something like that. Essentially, they are going to stay behind the lines, and I wouldn't bring too many of them with either, given that while they are powerful, you aren't actually going to have the need or ability to move them everywhere. Still, one catapult for, say, every company of crossbowmen and or footmen means that an army would have around 60 of these because of the 2 legions minimum, which is enough for siege situations, or if you really need to in the middle of a battle, you could potentially bring these out and use them as a way to take down enemy artillery or large formations of men who aren't really moving too fast. Clerics are a bit more interesting when it comes to the support, in that their use is very obvious in their name. They are clerics. They are going to be the combat medics, as well as the field surgeons. They are going to be the ones who make sure that those knights who have been fighting so hard for you are capable of giving just that little bit extra after losing maybe a limb or 2, or 7. Who knows, maybe they can even reattach them, since they do seem to potentially be capable of minor resurrection on people if they are very fresh. That is, of course, their main drawback, though, in that you would have to have them close to the front lines to be most effective, and providing the healing when it is most needed, but they're still going to be in a fair bit of danger while doing that. So honestly, I would put 4 of these for every mana pool of footmen, maybe 4 for every company of archers, and knights, well, they're going to have some in reserve who can come out and help. But I don't honestly think it would be possible to send clerics out with the knights. However, they also have one important function beyond just being able to heal, namely invisibility. For a brief short period of time, however brief short period you want, or essentially a longer one if they're stronger, they can make a unit go invisible, or a soldier. This is why they are very, very important to have beyond just their normal medical uses, because they are capable of allowing scouting missions to go completely undetected, or if you get enough of them and you really don't care about the people you're healing and or turning invisible, then perhaps you could even set up a sort of suicide mission, which actually works perfectly with the next person on our list to talk about. The final person we are going to talk about is the Conjurer, who honestly on the surface is not very useful. For starters, he can summon in creatures to fight, which, okay, on the surface that sounds neat, but one of them is a scorpion and the other is water, but we'll get back to the water. Other than that, he can throw fireballs, which are sort of useful, but crossbowmen are cheaper and more plentiful and able to survive longer, And he can even call down a rain of fireballs, but since that doesn't distinguish between friend or foe, he is way too deadly to have deployed on, say, a company level per se. You might be able to have one per mana pool for the entire army, so you would only have essentially a grand total of 60 of these for the 3 legions, and that is a fair number considering the one thing they would be very good at, and that is that water block we mentioned earlier. You see, unlike the scorpions who are more of a swarm thing, that water bloke, or water elemental, is actually a very, very big beater / stormtrooper. Not only that, if you were to, say, pay off the clerics, they could make those water elementals turn invisible. And since they are completely under the conjurer's control when they are summoned, you have invisible shock troopers who you could potentially either sneak behind enemy lines and have them completely destroy everything they come across there until they themselves are destroyed, which will take a lot of time and cause a lot of confusion, or maybe have them precede the charge of an army. But, again, that's something we will have to talk about in a little bit. And so we now have the full numbers of our army. 4,800 footmen, 2,400 archers or crossbowmen, 2,400 knights, 4,800 peasants dedicated to helping out the footmen, crossbowmen, and knights, with an additional 240 to help out the 60 catapults, 240 clerics to try their best to keep everyone alive, and 30 conjurers to come and deal combat damage to enemies, with a grand total of 14,670 men forming this army. Of course, that's assuming the officer corps is a part of the army, and I have reason to believe it would be given that there are knights, so that is actually something I built in to assume. But now, let us talk about how exactly this legion would fight by itself, shall we? When the army has the ability to set up how it fights its battles, it will set up its footmen in mana pools in a checkerboard pattern sort of like this. This will allow the crossbowmen to set up in front of them relatively easy and allow them to fight against the enemy. Then, depending on how the crossbowmen are doing against the enemy, the mana pools have 2 choices. They can either form one behind the other and go through the gaps between the units of crossbowmen, or should the enemy get to within a prearranged distance of the units, the crossbowmen can safely retreat behind them and allow the footmen to close in and fight against the enemy, while said crossbowmen or archers or whatever fire their death upon the foe from far away. Not as effective as the direct line from before, but they are safe and they are still able to kill the enemy, even if it's not all of them, and keep the footmen in line. Clerics will be rushing around, keeping the footmen alive, while conjurers could potentially be providing some support, though they would have to be careful about where and when they use them, so they won't be deployed in every battle. As the battle rages on, there would be mounting casualties on both sides, though hopefully the clerics would be able to keep this to a minimum, and the rotating staff of knights within the maniples would allow them to keep up the fight longer than their opponents. And then, when they seem to be at their weakest, when they are just right, the enemy is going to ask the question, what about the knights? All things going well, the knights should be deployed on the sides of the army, with the main cohort being deployed in the center, though I did not choose to show it since that would be the command one, and they would try not to get into the fighting. Either way, when the time became right, or if the enemy charged out their own cavalry, the knights could charge out along the sides. Should the enemy not have any cavalry, then that makes their job so much easier since they could just swing around the enemy formations, assuming there isn't terrain in the way, of course, galloping around as they ready their war cries, and then crash into the enemy's lines from the rear. This is a tactic known as a hammer and anvil. Should it work, then the enemy will be completely broken. Of course, this is depending on the footmen and the archers or crossbowmen holding the line and keeping it in place long enough for it to actually work. But given that they have the aids of clerics, or if things really go bad, a conjurer or two dropping spells on the enemy, then they should be capable of going in there, of crashing through the enemy lines, and of completely destroying them, running the enemy off the field as the other knights can chase them down. Then the army could theoretically go home, restock, resupply, recruit, and get ready for another campaign in the fields. Of course, this is all just my own musings on the subject of how I would organize the human army of the Kingdom of Azeroth for Warcraft. How exactly would you guys go about and do it? I'm genuinely curious. Do you think a combination legionary mana pull system with combined arms like this is the way to go? Or should I have focused in more on magic? Please feel free to let me know in the comments below or anywhere else you feel like. This has been That Man Over There. Thank you for listening, and have a nice day.